how you doing? It's Clayton here from howtodrawcomics.net and welcome to today's video. In this walkthrough, I'm going to be showing you how to draw up Pennywise from Stephen King's It. Now, as you can see, I'm beginning, as I begin every other comic book character, by laying down the initial foundations as a very simple, very rudimentary mannequin model. What this mannequin model allows me to do is it allows me to establish the proportions of the character, the placement of the character on the page, and the pose that the character is going to be in. And the reason that this is so important is because everything else that is going to come in on after this particular stage of the process, such as the costuming, the facial features, the facial expressions for that matter, every single little detail of rendering and shadowing and the finessed line work at the end is all going to be built on top of this very basic, very rough looking structure. But it's so important because if the character on a foundational level is drawn out of proportion from the very beginning, then everything that we lay in top later on is also going to be out of proportion. Literally, we're creating the skeleton for Pennywise here. And if you think about your own skeleton and all the muscles and the anatomy that's wrapped around those bones, even on top of your muscles, the skin, the clothing, the every single element that makes you who you are visually, it's all built on that underlying skeleton. And if any part of that skeleton is drawn out of proportion or mismeasured in some way, then that's going to affect everything that is built around it. If you've got an arm that is shorter than the other arm, it's probably because the skeleton at the very core of the anatomy of your arm is simply shorter than the opposite arm. And I know it kind of sounds obvious when I put it in those very simplistic terms, but it's very much the same thing that happens with our characters. If we don't get that underlying structure right from the very get-go, then our entire drawing simply becomes flawed from the very beginning. And the crazy thing is that this stuff is so hard to miss as well. It just goes unnoticed. So that's why me personally, I always try to only allow my mind to focus on those fundamental principles in the beginning. I don't let myself get caught up in the details or overwhelmed with the different aspects that essentially create the icing on top of the cake later on. I really leave room inside my mind to save mental RAM for only what needs to be considered at the particular pass, the particular step of the drawing at which I'm at. And as long as I can manage the process in that way, hopefully everything that matters at that point has been considered, and I can feel self-assured in moving on to the next step and knowing that the drawing is working well and that I've given myself the best chance of success with that comic book illustration. So you can see that once I've got that very basic, very simplistic mannequin model down and ready to go, and I'm happy with it, it's all sized up correctly, I'm satisfied with the pose, that it's expressing the personality of the character and who they are. What I'll do next is I'll create another layer above that, and I'll start to lay in some of the design elements that are going to go into the costume's facial features, their hairstyle, and the costume design itself. And I also keep this stage very loose as well. I keep it rough. The lines are really, at the end of the day, kept this way so that I can feel as though I've got the freedom to explore the artwork, to experiment, because by working in this loose kind of way, in a relaxed kind of way, not only does it take the pressure off of me to really produce something final at this stage, it allows me to it allows room for mistakes to occur, because I can feel totally free to erase an entire arm or an entire leg or the entire character for that matter if need be, because the work is so rough and it took me a minimal amount of time to lay down onto the page in the first place. Whereas if I've jumped ahead a few steps and I've started to articulate everything to the nth degree of refinement, then I'm going to be somewhat hesitant about making the changes that may need to be made in order to create an illustration that is the best that it possibly can be. So I try to keep it loose as least as possible as I can for that reason. Now I'm using the pencil tool within Manga Studio to loosely sketch up this design draft essentially that I'm creating for Pennywise. And I guess as we move on to the pen tool here and the final inks for the artwork, it might be a good time to speak about exactly how I'm throwing down the line you're seeing me use to articulate the final artwork. And the thing is, I often get asked this, how do you get such fine-lined renderings, such loose-looking lines in your design sketch, such finesse lines within your finished inks? And honestly, I don't use any special brushes or anything like that. Most of the settings that come shipped with Manga Studios, I leave as the defaults. What allows me to lay down the lines that you're seeing me lay down here in this demonstration comes down ultimately to the amount of pressure that I'm applying to my stylus and my tablet. Now my tablet is essentially a very old tablet. It's an Intuos 3 in fact. And I've never really looked back after getting that tablet just because it really does everything I wanted to do. And it's very likely that the reason that I haven't upgraded it in such a long time is because I simply become very comfortable using it. I calibrated the amount of pressure that I applied to that tablet in order to get the lines that I wanted onto the page. Now the other thing that comes into play in a big way here is also the size of the brush. So there's going to be times where I use a larger size to get larger sized lines, heavier looking lines on the page. And there's going to be times where I'm laying in some very, very intricate, very subtle render lines that require the lightest amount of pressure on my tablet and the smallest size brush that I can get onto the page. So all of this comes down to a simple balance, a calibration essentially between the brush size that you're using and the amount of pressure you're applying to your tablet as you work. And the thing is that even if I told you exactly what kind of pressure I'm applying to my stylus as I work and what brush size I'm using here, that wouldn't necessarily guarantee you that you were going to end up with the same result as you can see here. Because ultimately, you're going to have a natural amount of pressure that you apply to your own tablet, regardless of whether or not I tell you what I'm doing here. You may have a completely different model of tablet that does require you to press harder or press lighter, depending on the kind of line work that you want to lay down onto the page. So the way in which you're going to achieve similar line work to the lines that you're seeing here is through experimentation and exploration. You're going to have to try out different sizes for your brush, different amounts of pressure to get the look that you want to go for. It's pretty much exactly what I did. I went out there on my own. I had my inspirations there to help me to direct the style that I knew I wanted my artwork to be presented in. So other comic book artists that I looked up to, such as David Finch and Mark Silvestri, even Michael Turner. He is one of the best artists to reference when it comes to line weighting. And I look at these artists and I ask myself, well, what kind of pressure would I have to apply to my brush, to my stylus, if I wanted to achieve a similar look within my finished comic book inks? And I tried it out. I'd draw one stroke down to the page, I'd draw another stroke at a different amount of pressure, different size, and I'd see what I could come up with. And slowly but surely, through those experiences, what it allowed me to do is to arrive at the ideal line that I knew I needed to use in particular situations, because I don't always use the same amount of pressure or the same brush size to lay down every single line within my artwork. There's occasions where I will need to use a larger brush with a heavier amount of pressure applied in order to get a particular result that I might be after. So it all ultimately comes down to the context to which you're laying these lines down in, and you personally, how you naturally work as an artist. You don't necessarily have to take on board everything that I'm necessarily saying here. It mostly comes down to you and getting to know yourself and what you're comfortable with. Even the fact that I'm using Manga Studio here, maybe that's not an application that you're necessarily comfortable working in. Maybe, for example, you prefer to use, instead of the G pen, which I use within Manga Studio, maybe there's another pen in here that's just going to be more suitable for the kind of outcome that you're looking for. And so I'd encourage you to step out there on your own. It can be scary without that, without someone there to hold you by the hand, but it's ultimately something that all of us have to do as artists in order to find ourselves, to find our style, and to find the best approach that is going to work for us. Now, in saying that, what I'd like to do here as we begin laying in the final inks for Pennywise is I'd like to talk about how over time I've somewhat optimized my entire comic art creation process. And one of the ways in which I've done that is I've essentially cut out, you may have noticed, the final penciling stage. So what I've done here is I've basically jumped straight from the rough draft into the final inks. And one of the reasons in which I did that is that in the way in which I used to work, it'd take me, say, 4 to 8 hours to get the polished penciled work down onto the page before I went over the top of it and inked it, which, as it so happens, would take just about as long. It'd take me a good 8 hours or so to get that line work inked in, equaling about 16 hours in total of production time. Naturally, because my artwork is often so full of detail, it'd take me a long time to produce a single piece of artwork, an embarrassingly long amount of time. An amount of time that really just wouldn't float in the real world, in an actual studio where I had to stick to particular deadlines. So I had to find a solution to this problem because I didn't really want to have the quality of my artwork suffer simply because it took too long to arrive at the finished product. So what I decided to do was I looked at my process and I said, something has to go here. There's got to be a way in which I can speed up this process while still at the same time maintaining the look that I want for my artwork to have. And what I realized is that at the end of the day, the finished comic book illustration is going to be an inked representation of the artwork. So I wondered, why was I taking all this time, this additional 8 hours of production time to pencil it out when I was just going to ink straight over the top of those polished pencils and no one was going to really see them anyway? And so the decision I came to was that, as unconfident and somewhat fearful as I was to jump straight from the rough draft to the finished inks, I decided that I was just going to cut out the polished pencils altogether and begin wrapping up the final line art with the inks right from the get-go, right after I finished up with that initial draft. And that was a little bit intimidating at first, I'm not going to lie. In fact, in the beginning, I'm always very reluctant to try something new, as we all often are. We like to stick within our comfort zone, and it's kind of tough to try out something that might be of a major benefit for us in the long run, as this was for me. But I stuck with it. I knew that I had to make this work somehow, so I jumped into the deep end and I started just inking straight up the finished lines right over the top of that very rough, very rudimentary design sketch. And it was a little bit strange to begin with. I actually got an okay result the first or second time around, and slowly but surely I became more and more comfortable working straight with the pen tool, even though the polished pencils weren't there necessarily to guide me along the way anymore. And that's when I really started realizing how much I had to calibrate the entire process. You remember we were speaking about before how different pressures of the tablet and different size brushes to get the line work that I wanted to go for. Well, ultimately, I had to kind of do that along the way because all the line weights that initially I'd laid down with the penciling tool back in my previous version of the process just weren't there. I had to kind of do that first time round with the inked line work. And so that was a very interesting process because the inking brush and the penciling brush within Manga Studio not only work very differently, they feel very different. The G Pen, which I love Manga Studio for, actually feels as though you're using a pen of some kind in the traditional sense. And the penciling tool feels like a pencil. I think that maybe it's just that somehow their engine, their application engine or something that allows the brushes to react in certain ways to the amount of pressure or the movement that you're using on the stylus to get that line work down. But I've found that Manga Studio is an excellent program for that reason. However, as I said, if you're looking at this in a traditional sense, there's a reason as to why inking and penciling are two separate specializations. It's because they require a different skill set and a different practice. So I essentially had to learn how to do the same thing I was doing with the penciling tool, but now with the inking brush instead. That meant recalibrating the amount of pressure I was applying to my tablet and the size of my brush as I worked. That took maybe a few days to do, though. It wasn't such a big deal. It just meant that I had to go back and let go of what I'd learned before and essentially reinvent my method of working for the greater good. Because you know what? Once I really got this down, once I started just inking up my work over the top of that rough draft, I cut the production time that I was taking initially in half. It took me exactly half the time to do the work that I was doing previously. And that was a massive chunk of production time that I was able to let loose, which was amazing for me because it meant that, hey, you know what, I'm not so embarrassed as to how long it actually takes me to complete a full illustration now. And also on top of that, I had the opportunity now to go in with the pen tool and lay in the finished line work in the way that it was ultimately going to be presented to my audience, which in the end is all that matters, is that the inked lines look good. The pencils, assuming that you're inking right in over the top of them, don't really matter so much. So this rejig of my method became a major milestone in the evolution of my process, and all of this is to say that I think as an artist, you're always going to be on the path of constantly getting to know who you are, not only on the level that you learn about the kind of ideas that you want to present to the world, the kind of artwork that you want to express, but also the way that you work and feel most comfortable working. I think that no matter what level you're at, there's always some room to improve, whether that be cutting down the time of your production process or branching out into an area of improvement that maybe you're uncomfortable or even scared to venture into, to tackle, to conquer. And the reality is that in order for us to level up, in order for us to get to that place that we want to be, the epitome of what we can be as an artist, oftentimes that means facing challenges that we would much more quickly want to ignore. So ultimately, in the end, being an artist requires you to be brave if you want to improve and to go head on directly into the areas that you're trying to avoid, making the mistakes you need to make in order to learn for the greater good. And it's going to be rocky territory. You're not going to necessarily have a clear idea of what direction to go in the entire time. But I say embrace that. Really try to push yourself to lean in to those parts of your process, those parts of your skill set that feel the most uncomfortable so that you can conquer them and that you don't have to fear them anymore. Because they're the areas, the exact place where you're going to make the most amount of growth, the most amount of progress. Okay, so back to the artwork here. You can see that now I've got the overall outline done for Pennywise. What I've essentially pursued is placing in and rejigging some of the line weights around the character to get certain areas standing out against others and to give some visual pop to the artwork, which I think is always something that you want to do. That's the gift that line weights really give to your artwork, is they add a little bit of visual interest to the contours of your illustration themselves, which is never a bad thing for captivating your audience and increasing the amount of immersion that you can incorporate into your comic book illustrations. The moment I started using line weights was the moment that my artwork really jumped from something that, of course, before line weights, my artwork looked okay. It was great. It was fantastic. But the moment I started to use them, to incorporate them into my work to help to make certain elements of my characters or my illustrations distinct from one another, to bring some of those elements forward and increase the amount of focus on the key areas I wanted the audience to pay attention to, and of course to describe form and lighting conditions, that's when my artwork took a massive jump in terms of its quality. It really did inject that professional level of quality to it, and I never looked back after that. I kept on laying in those line weights again and again, and eventually I got to the point where it just became very natural for me to lay the line weights that I was incorporating into my line work down, and I didn't really have to think about it or intentionally try to put them in. Maybe like the first day I learned about them and started trying to apply them, but after a while, I just naturally started placing them into my contours along the trajectory of those lines, and it made a massive difference. Really, I think the key thing is to always be conscious when using line weights of the lighting condition within the scene and the direction that the light is projecting down onto your character from. And on top of that, you also want to think about what elements are going to be overlapping other elements, because the parts of the character, say for example some of the areas of the costume on Pennywise here, some of those areas are going to be overlapping other areas, and the areas on top you're going to want to exemplify a little bit. You want to try to get them a certain amount of pop happening by increasing the thickness of the line weight around the base of that element as it overlaps against whatever it is underneath it. So line weights are an incredibly valuable resource and tool for you to use as a comic book artist, and I'd highly recommend just having a go. It's all experimentation. You're going to use line weights, very likely, in a completely different way to the way in which I use line weights, and that's absolutely fine. That's totally okay. At this point, the key contours for Pennywise have been established very, very clearly, and the reason that I do that, first and foremost, is just because it gives me a good idea as to how I'm going to approach the rendering, especially if I've already gone ahead and I've started laying in the shadows, because what tends to happen is the way in which I placed in the line weights that helps me to determine where the shadows should be placed and how much shadow should be placed in a given area throughout the character. And beyond that, the shadows help me to figure out where I'm going to place the rendering. Now, back before I really started changing up my style, and my style has over time gone through somewhat of an evolution, you could say, whereas before, what you'd end up seeing here is a lot of thick, very dramatic cinematic shadow, where I'd have a rendition of Pennywise that almost looked as though he'd stepped out of a noir film of some kind. And part of the reason for that is because I am, and kind of, will always be, a very big fan of the work of David Finch, who just so happens to use a ton of shadow within his comic book art. And so I replicated that in the beginning. I wanted to be just like David Finch. I wanted my artwork to look and have the same aesthetic as his work did. And so I incorporated a lot of thick, a lot of heavy, a lot of dramatic, moody shadow onto my characters. But what I started to find was that the kind of effects that was preventing me from achieving was just, situations where I'd have an everyday scene that just didn't require that kind of dramatic feel, that the shadows and the amount of shadow that was in the work, the intensity, was starting to prevent me from conveying. Because really, those shadowed styles are quite appropriate for very dramatic type scenes where you are maybe looking at a detective in his office and there's lots of shadow around, very minimal light. But for me in everyday situations, that really just didn't work out because, I'd try to convey a character in a coffee shop, for example, and the coffee shop would be fully lit. The environment would be like a nice, almost blissful scene that I wanted people to relate with. But then I found myself needing and wanting to try and add in all this shadow and all this rendering, trying to make it moody, trying to make it look kind of grungy looking, and it just wasn't working out. It wasn't capturing the feeling that it needed to capture. So I started asking myself, is there another style here, another approach that I could take that would allow me to still incorporate a ton of detail into my work because I love that detail, but also allow me to present scenes that were less dramatic, that didn't require all that super heavy shadow. And really, I guess I hadn't experimented that much with presenting my artwork as such. I had drawn so many situations for my characters where they were doused in shadow, in these warehouses that were super dimly lit, and I hadn't really practiced enough scenarios where the character was presented as being, walking around a park in a blissful scenario of some kind. So I started to tweak my approach there a little bit more as well, and I looked toward the art of Mark Silvestri, who just happened to be one of David Finch's mentors, in fact. And Mark Silvestri's art has changed over time as well, his rendering style, the amount of detail he includes in his work, but I found that his rendering style in particular really lent to the kind of look and dynamic approach that I wanted to start to take with the scenarios that my characters would take part in. And so I started trying to almost emulate his style, but what I later realized is that my natural direction that I wanted to take with the look of my rendering actually played right into the way that he did his rendering. So what you'll notice is that there's very rare occasions as I lay in the very subtle, very thin and elegant render lines here against the various areas of Pennywise, where those render lines are running horizontally form. In fact, most of the time, the render lines are running parallel to it lengthwise. So later on, as I lay in the cross hatches at the very end here to increase some of the contrast within the rendering that I've laid down thus far, you'll see the difference. You'll see that some of those render lines end up being horizontal and running horizontal around the equator of each form, whereas the render lines that I'm laying down in the first pass are essentially running its length. And it's a little bit hard to explain here. Maybe you can, if you look back at some of the old comic book art from the 80s, from the 70s, you'll see what I mean. A lot of the render lines that are placed down don't run along the forearm, for example. They run against it into the light. And I guess I just found that I naturally work differently and like to work differently, and found it easier to lay my render lines in this fashion. Now I say render lines, really they're just hatches, right? So you can call them what you want. But yeah, I found that this was a much better approach, and it was really something that I began to observe about Mark Silvestri's work that we kind of had in common, and I slowly but surely integrated his look, his aesthetic into my own style more and more. I, of course, took what I had learned from David Finch, but I then combined it with the new approach that I took with Mark Silvestri's style, and eventually they became this weird hybrid that I called Clayton's style, and I just kind of went with it. And over time it refined more and more and more, and I ended up creating my own look, and that was something really special that I saw beginning to take place. And still till this day, I see my artwork changing and growing with me. It really is. Your style is a living thing. I'm telling you, it'll mature and it'll grow with you the more that you practice and the more that you learn. It's not always going to stay as the same look. It's not always going to be the same. And this was something that initially really bothered me because consistency is very important, or at least I placed a lot of importance on it in the beginning, because your fans, the people, the audience that love your artwork, they like it for a specific reason. They enjoy the look of it, they like the style. And if that style starts to change or you start to work in a different way, not only does that begin to become difficult for you to keep track of, you kind of sit at your desk going, okay, what style am I today? What style should I draw in today? And you become a little bit lost in that sense. But also on top of that, there's this fear that your fans are going to leave because your artwork isn't 100% exactly the same as it was yesterday. And that is a false belief that I created for myself, a limiting belief that was really holding me back from pushing myself to evolve for the longest time. So I guess letting go of those beliefs that you have about your art that are holding you back is a very important thing. And it's funny because as time goes on, I begin to realize more and more and more that things are really only as hard as we want them to be. And I guess oftentimes when we feel as though we've come so far and we've got this big feat, this big dream that we want to achieve, when we want our artwork to be a certain way and we want to evolve, we want to get better, there's this inclination to believe that it needs to be hard, it must be difficult, because anything worth doing rather, is going to be hard to achieve. And I believe that, and I think that is definitely true to an extent. But there does come a time after the learning period where you really have to embrace where you're at and allow yourself the freedom to move beyond, to progress, because you are going to arrive at the place that you're trying to get to within your artwork, and you're either going to plateau and your artwork is never going to change. It's always going to look at the same. You're always going to have the exact same ideas, work within the exact same genres and themes. Or you're going to continue pushing past that point and become the epitome that you can possibly be with your artwork. And to me, that's exciting. I think that thinking about how my artwork will look in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now is just mind-boggling. Like it's hard to comprehend. If you keep pushing yourself as much as you are now, imagine where you could be years from this point in time with your artwork. It's almost unfathomable, but you're going to fall more and more in love with your style. And when you have no left to give for it, when you're bored with it, guess what? That's the moment that you're going to step it up. That's when you're going to reach that next point, that next evolution within the look of your work. And you know what? As for the fans, they're going to follow along with you. I remember David Raposa talking about this very same thing, because he would often do back in the day these insanely complex and intricately rendered paintings. You may have in fact seen some of his work, the famous Ninja Turtle series that he did. Absolutely stunning work. You can look him up. But I remember him saying that when he switched to a more comic book type style, a lot of his fans kind of harked up about it. They were like, why are you going with this more simplistic style? We love your rendered, realistic looking paintings. And you know what happened? Dave Raposa actually began finding new fans because new people began to see that evolution in his style, and he created a whole new audience. And the fans that really mattered, they loved the work just because it was him doing it. They loved the fact that he was making progress, that he was pushing himself to the next level, and on top of that, he got that new audience. So there's always that balance. As you sacrifice one part of your work, as you put more and more dedication into it, you're going to get just as much out of it. And I really do believe that there is some truth to reaping what you sow. I don't think there is a truer saying out there. In fact, I think you really do get out whatever you put in. And you shouldn't be afraid of evolving or progressing. And that was something definitely that I was guilty of for a very long time, until I said to myself, you know what, this is a good thing. And I guess, having created howtodrawcomics.net and working on these insanely long courses that took such a long time to produce, my artwork inevitably changed over the months that I was working on them, and that was a major fear I had. I would look back at the start of a course that I began working on, say a couple months ago, and I'd see the artwork, and then I'd compare that to how far I'd come over those months, and I just wanted to go back and redo the entire thing. And you know what I did? And I rehashed a lot of things, I reworked it, and yeah, sure, it probably came out better than what it would have had been. But at the same time, I also maybe missed a few things. Like I maybe missed a few opportunities. Maybe what I had achieved was something that was good enough, that could have really helped people if I just had to put it out at the time. I guess in hindsight, that those things are easy to look at, but at the time, I think that those insecurities plague us all. The quality of our work and the amount of progress that we make, we look back on our old pieces and we almost cringe at how bad they were, but you gotta have a certain amount of respect for them almost, and love for them, because without those artworks that at the time you thought were amazing, but now you look back on as maybe a little bit subpar compared to what you can do now, you wouldn't be where you're at now without them. And that's what makes them special, at least in my opinion. And that's what really changed my mind about all of this stuff. And you also have to remember as well that unless you make some huge significant change in your style, like you completely jump to a whole other genre like Dave Raposa did, most people won't notice the subtleties of improvement within your style. In general, it'll just kind of slowly transition over time in an unnoticeable way, and people aren't really going to pay attention unless they're comparing an artwork you did like 6 years ago to an artwork that you're doing now, assuming that you have made significant progress. So for the most part, as you can see, I've got Pennywise rendered up and ready to go. I've got all the folds and the wrinkles and the creases within his outfit rendered to the nth degree, and what I've tried to do, by the way, is I've really tried with that rendering to describe not only the kind of material and the tone of material that Pennywise is wearing on his costume, but also the looseness of the fabric of that costume as it wraps around the various parts of his body. So you can see up around the shoulders, we've got those very puffy sleeves, yet around the forearm, the material is actually hugging very closely to his forearm. And so what I found is that you have to kind of approach these different sections of a character's costume, especially one that is this complex, with a great deal of care and consideration in order to get it looking correct, because as the material pulls and tightens around certain areas as it bulges out and hangs off of the body, that's going to affect the thickness of the folds and the creases that you're going to need to render out in that material. And so that was one dilemma that I ran into multiple times, I have to say, during the rendering process, and even outlining some of those major folds and creases within the fabric. It was kind of tough to figure out how to approach it. One thing that really helped me out, of course, was just having some reference on hand of the new Pennywise from the latest movie to ensure that the depiction of him was accurate, and that the way in which I was laying in the rendering and articulating the line weights and the wrinkles and all those little details that really go into it, we're presenting him in the correct way, in an accurate way that that wasn't going to come back later on and bite me. But as you can see here, I'm laying in some drop shadows, and I always have a little bit of trouble with the drop shadows. I've got to admit, they don't always work out the best, and I do have to get my eraser out multiple times in order to really nail them. And I don't ever want to erase or cut out those parts from my process too often, because I think it's important to see that no matter how long you've been drawing for, no matter how long you've been creating comics for, there's always going to be those points where you got to pull out the eraser. No one gets it perfect the first time round. And if you go back and you watch this video, one thing I'd like you to observe is just how many times I erase that rendering, especially on the outfit, and lay it back in over and over and over again, especially real time. It's almost torturous to watch. So you can see what I'm doing here is placing in those cross hatches over the top of the hatches that I've already laid down for the rendering, and I'm still pressing ultra lightly on my stylus, and I've got the tiniest little brush there. You can probably barely see it as I lay in those lines, but I'm trying to create very subtle gradients that have increased contrast here as I lay those cross hatches over the top of the rendering I've already established. And this can really add an additional level of depth and three-dimensionality to the different aspects of your character. And it all comes down to the lighting ultimately, as to how you judge the placement of these crosshatches. I think that it's very tempting to over-render your work, and that's when you start to lose visual balance. That's when things start to get lost, and you really, at the end of the day, the thing at the top of your list of priorities within your comic book art should be to ensure that the forms are reading correctly, that they're easy to make out. You do not want to be placing in a congested mess of rendering that just does not describe anything in any visually discernible way. So that'd be my advice to you, is to just always try to make sure that as you detail out your work and you lay in that rendering, you try to resist the temptation to overdo it, because it's a lot easier to place in too many details than it is to take it back a bit and leave them out. That pretty much wraps up today's demonstration. I hope that you enjoyed the video and that you got a ton of value out of it. Please be sure to subscribe to this channel if you'd like to see more comic art tutorials. Leave me your thoughts in the comment section below this video. Let me know what you thought and whether or not you got some value out of it. And also be sure to check out www.howtodrawcomics.net and check out some of the free comic art tutorials and content that we've got over on the side. There's also a fantastic comic art community that you're more than welcome to join and be a part of. I'm there. I like to visit the forums very regularly just to see some of the cool artwork our members are posting. It's totally free to sign up as well, and you get to interact and you get to mingle with other like-minded comic book artists who are on very much the same journey as you and I, just out there trying to increase their dynamic drawing skills and take them to the next level. So again, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. See you later.